The coffee was still warm when David arrived that Tuesday afternoon, just like we'd planned every month for the past 3 years. I had set the table with the good china, the white porcelain set with tiny blue flowers that had belonged to his grandmother. He used to say it made even simple sandwiches taste special, but something felt different the moment he walked through my kitchen door. His usual smile seemed rehearsed, and he avoided my eyes while settling into the chair across from mine. I'd made his favorite, turkey and Swiss with that mustard he liked, the kind I had to drive to 3 different stores to find because the regular grocery didn't carry it anymore. "Mom," he said, cutting his sandwich into precise quarters the way he'd done since childhood, "we need to talk." My heart fluttered the way it does when you sense bad news approaching, but can't yet identify its shape. I poured his coffee, adding exactly 1 sugar cube and a splash of cream, the ritual we'd shared through countless conversations over the years, through homework struggles in high school, through his college graduation, through job interviews and breakups and all the small victories and defeats that make up a life. "Of course, sweetheart. What's on your mind?" He took a sip of coffee, set the cup down with deliberate care, and finally looked directly at me. "Things are changing, Mom. Amanda and we're really building something together. A life. Our life." I smiled, genuinely happy despite the strange tension in his voice. "I'm so proud of you both. Marriage is a beautiful thing, David. Your father and That's just it," he interrupted, his voice taking on a tone I'd never heard before, distant, almost clinical. "Amanda is the woman of my life now, my priority, my future." He paused, choosing his words with the precision of someone who'd rehearsed this conversation. "I need space, Mom. We need space." The words hung between us like smoke, visible but incomprehensible. Space from what? I'd always been careful not to intrude, calling only once a week, visiting only when invited. I helped with wedding preparations when asked, offered advice only when requested. I thought I'd been the model of a respectful mother-in-law. "I don't understand," I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. "Have I done something wrong?" David's jaw tightened, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of the boy who used to run to me with scraped knees and hurt feelings, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by this stranger who wore my son's face but spoke with someone else's voice. "It's not about right or wrong, Mom. It's about boundaries, about Amanda feeling comfortable in our marriage without interference." Interference. The word hit me like a physical blow. Every Sunday dinner I'd cooked, every birthday cake I'd baked, every Christmas morning I'd spent preparing gifts with the joy of someone who believed family meant forever, all of it reduced to interference. "I see," I managed, though I didn't see it all. "And what does this space look like?" He finished his sandwich methodically, chewing each bite longer than necessary, buying time before delivering the final blow. "Less frequent contact, maybe monthly instead of weekly calls, and holidays. Well, Amanda wants to start our own traditions. Just the 2 of us. Just the 2 of them." I nodded, my hands wrapped around my coffee cup for warmth, though the kitchen suddenly felt arctic, despite the late spring sunshine streaming through the windows. The flowers I'd planted in the garden, the ones David used to help me tend when he was young, seemed to mock me from their beds outside, bright and cheerful and utterly oblivious to the winter descending inside. "I understand," I said, and part of me did. Marriage changes things. Priorities shift. New families form. I'd always known this day would come, when his love would be shared and eventually redirected. I just hadn't expected it to feel like being erased. David stood up, brushing invisible crumbs from his perfectly pressed shirt, a shirt Amanda had chosen for him, no doubt, since he'd never cared about fashion before. "I knew you'd understand, Mom. You've always been reasonable. Reasonable." Once, he'd called me wise. Once, he'd sought my advice on everything from science projects to college applications to career decisions. Now, I was simply reasonable, a manageable obstacle that could be moved aside with the right words and sufficient firmness. He kissed my cheek before leaving, a brief, dutiful gesture that felt more like a dismissal than affection. After his car disappeared down the street, I sat alone in my kitchen, surrounded by the remnants of what I hadn't known would be our last real conversation. The good china seemed ridiculous now, too formal for this new reality where I was no longer worth the effort of special occasions. I cleared the table slowly, washing each piece by hand, though they were dishwasher safe, needing the familiar rhythm of routine to steady my trembling hands. If you like emotional stories like this one, please subscribe. We're trying to reach 1,000 friends here who understand that life's deepest moments often happen in the quietest spaces. And tell me, from which city are you watching? I'd love to know you're out there, listening to this story that might feel familiar in ways that both comfort and ache. That night, I sat in my living room holding the photo of David at his wedding, his face radiant with joy as he gazed at Amanda, her white dress flowing around them like a promise of forever. They looked so happy, so complete, so utterly sufficient unto themselves. I placed the photo face down in the drawer of the side table, not in anger, but in acceptance. Some truths are too painful to look at every day, even when they're beautiful truths, even when they represent everything you'd hoped for your child. The phone didn't ring that evening, or the next, or the next. Space, I learned, was a vast and silent country where love went to wait patiently for permission to exist. The change came gradually, like seasons shifting, so subtle at first that I told myself I was imagining things. David's monthly calls became every 6 weeks, then every 2 months. His voice, when he did call, carried the hurried tone of someone checking an item off a to-do list, rather than a son wanting to connect with his mother. "Hi, Mom. Just calling to check in. Everything okay?" Such a simple question, yet loaded with the expectation of a simple answer. I learned to give him what he wanted. "Yes, sweetheart, everything's fine. How are you and Amanda?" "Good, good. Busy with work. Amanda's been taking those cooking classes she mentioned. She's really talented." I bit back the urge to mention that I'd offered to teach Amanda my mother's bread recipe, the one David had always loved, and how she'd smiled politely and said she preferred learning from professional instructors. Instead, I said, "That's wonderful. I'm sure you're eating well." "Yeah, she's amazing. Listen, Mom, I've got to run. Meeting some friends for dinner. I'll talk to you soon." Soon stretched longer each time, like a rubber band being pulled until I wondered when it would snap completely. The first Christmas after his request for space, I waited for an invitation that never came. I'd always hosted Christmas dinner, a tradition that stretched back to when David was small and would wake me at dawn, bouncing on my bed with excitement about what Santa had brought. I'd spent weeks planning menus, comparing recipes, making lists of who liked what and who was allergic to which ingredients. That December, I found myself wandering the grocery store aisles, automatically reaching for cranberry sauce and stuffing mix, before remembering that I'd be spending the holiday alone. The elderly woman behind me in the checkout line looked at my sparse basket, just milk, bread, and a small chicken, and smiled kindly. "Quiet Christmas this year?" she asked. "Something like that," I replied, unable to admit that my only child had simply forgotten to include me in his celebration. I drove past their house that Christmas morning, telling myself I was just taking a different route to church. Through their front window, I could see Amanda arranging presents under a tree I'd never seen before. Not the ornaments I'd collected over 30 years of Christmases with David, but new ones, elegant and coordinated, probably chosen to match Amanda's sophisticated decorating scheme. David appeared in the window, laughing at something she'd said, and for a moment he looked so much like his father that my chest ached. They looked like a magazine photograph of domestic bliss, young, beautiful, perfectly matched. There was no room in that picture for a 62-year-old woman with graying hair and laugh lines earned through decades of smaller celebrations. I drove on to church, where I sat in the back pew and listened to carols I'd sung with David when he was young enough to stand on the kneeler beside me, his voice piping along with mine in enthusiastic, slightly off-key harmony. The sanctuary was filled with families, grandparents bouncing toddlers on their knees, teenagers slouching beside their parents with feigned boredom that didn't quite hide their affection. After the service, several people asked about David. "How's that handsome son of yours?" Margaret Wilson wanted to know. "When are you going to be a grandmother?" I smiled and gave vague answers about him being happy and busy with his new marriage, steering conversations away from topics that highlighted my growing absence from his life. It wasn't shame exactly, but something close to it. The peculiar embarrassment of being loved less than others expected, as if I'd somehow failed at the fundamental job of remaining important to my child. February brought David's birthday, and I debated for days whether calling would violate his need for space. I finally dialed his number, my heart racing like a teenager calling a crush. "Hey, Mom," he answered, but I could hear voices in the background, laughter, music, the sounds of a party in progress. "I don't want to interrupt," I said quickly. I just wanted to wish you a happy birthday. Thanks. Listen, we're actually in the middle of something right now. Amanda threw me a surprise party with some people from work. Can I call you back later? Later never came, but I hadn't really expected it to. I'd already learned that in David's new life, later meant never, and soon meant when convenient, which was rarely. The birthday gift I'd chosen, a leather portfolio for his work papers engraved with his initials, sat on my kitchen table for 3 weeks before I finally mailed it. He sent a brief text acknowledging receipt. Thanks for the portfolio. Very nice. Very nice. Once he would have called immediately, excited about any gift, eager to share his appreciation. Now his gratitude came in corporate language, polite and distant. Spring arrived, and I found myself driving past the park where I'd taken David as a child, where he'd learned to ride his bicycle and caught his first fish in the small pond. Young mothers pushed strollers along the familiar paths, their toddlers running ahead with the fearless joy of children who know they're watched and loved and safe. I remembered being one of those mothers, remembered the exhaustion and exhilaration of those early years when every day brought new words, new discoveries, new reasons to marvel at the miracle of watching a human being unfold. David had been such a curious child, always asking questions, always wanting to know how things worked and why people acted the way they did. "Mom, why do leaves change colors?" he'd asked during one of our autumn walks through this same park. "Because they're getting ready to rest," I'd explained. "Sometimes beautiful things have to let go so new, beautiful things can grow." I'd thought I understood that metaphor then, but sitting alone on the bench where we'd shared countless afternoons, I realized I'd never imagined being the thing that had to let go. Amanda, I learned through the neighborhood gossip network, was pregnant. Mrs. Henderson from next door mentioned it casually while we were both collecting our mail, assuming I already knew. "How exciting about the baby," she said, her face bright with the vicarious joy that grandmothers-to-be usually inspire. "You must be over the moon." I managed to smile and nod, saving my questions and confusion for the privacy of my own home. A grandchild. David was going to be a father, and I'd learned about it from a neighbor who'd heard it from her daughter who worked with Amanda's sister. That night I called him, breaking my own rule about waiting for his contact. "David, Mrs. Henderson mentioned some wonderful news." A pause. A long, uncomfortable pause that told me everything I needed to know. "Yeah, we were going to call you. Amanda's 12 weeks along. We wanted to wait until we were sure everything was okay." 12 weeks. 3 months of secret joy. 3 months of doctor appointments and planning and excitement that I'd been excluded from completely. I wondered if they'd already chosen names, if they'd decorated a nursery, if Amanda had that radiant glow that pregnant women often carry. "I'm so happy for you both," I said, and meant it despite the ache of being told rather than included. "How is Amanda feeling?" "Good. Really good. She's been reading everything she can about pregnancy and babies. You know how thorough she is." I did know, though I wondered if she'd read anything about the value of grandparents, about the support systems that helped new parents navigate the beautiful chaos of raising children. I wondered if she knew that I'd successfully raised a son who'd grown into a man capable of love and commitment, even if that love no longer extended to me. Well, please give her my congratulations. If she needs anything at all. "That's nice of you, Mom, but we've got it covered. Amanda's mom is already planning to come stay for a few weeks after the birth, help out with everything." Amanda's mom would be there for the birth, for the first precious weeks, for all the moments I'd dreamed of sharing with my first grandchild. I would be once again, watching from the outside, reasonable and understanding and utterly unnecessary. After I hung up, I sat in my living room looking at the rocking chair in the corner, the same chair where I'd nursed David during those long, sweet nights when it was just him and me and the magic of new life. I'd refinished it last year, thinking hopefully about future grandbabies who might need rocking and singing, and the kind of unconditional love that only grandmothers seem to have infinite reserves of. Now it sat empty, a monument to assumptions that had proven naive. I was about to become a grandmother, and somehow, that joy felt more like another ending than a beginning. I decided to try again. Maybe I'd been too passive, too willing to accept the distance. Maybe what David and Amanda needed was to see that I could be helpful without being intrusive, supportive without being overwhelming. The pregnancy seemed like the perfect opportunity to show them I understood boundaries while still being the kind of mother and mother-in-law they could rely on. I spent weeks researching the perfect gift, something practical but not presumptuous, useful but not overwhelming. Finally, I settled on a collection of organic baby clothes in neutral colors, soft cotton onesies and tiny socks that seemed impossibly small in my hands. I included a hand-knitted blanket, the same pattern I'd made for David when he was born, worked in cream-colored yarn that would suit any nursery color scheme. The card took me longer to write than the blanket had taken to knit. How do you express love and excitement while respecting boundaries that seem to shift like sand? How do you offer support to someone who's made it clear that your support isn't particularly wanted? Finally, I wrote simply, "For our little blessing, with all my love and hopes for this beautiful new chapter, I'm here if you need anything at all." I dropped the package at their door on a Saturday morning, choosing a time when I knew they'd both be home but early enough that I wouldn't seem to be fishing for an invitation inside. Through the front window, I could see Amanda arranging flowers in a vase, white lilies that looked expensive and elegant, the kind of decoration that belonged in magazines rather than lived in homes. 3 weeks passed without acknowledgement, no call, no text, no brief note of thanks. I began to wonder if the package had somehow gone missing, if perhaps it had been delivered to the wrong address or stolen from their porch. Finally, I called David. "Hi, sweetheart. I just wanted to make sure that little package I left made it to you okay?" "Oh, yeah. Amanda got it. She said to tell you thanks." Said to tell you thanks. Not even a direct thank you, but a second-hand message delivered with all the enthusiasm of someone passing along information about garbage pickup schedules. I waited for him to say something more. About the blanket I'd spent evenings working on while watching television alone, about the time I'd taken to choose each tiny garment, about the love that had gone into every stitch and every careful fold. Instead, he said, "Listen, Mom, I should probably mention, Amanda's been feeling pretty overwhelmed lately. All the attention from people wanting to help with the baby. She's asked me to let everyone know that we've got everything handled for now." Everyone. I'd become part of a category, lumped in with well-meaning but excessive relatives and friends who apparently needed to be managed rather than appreciated. I was no longer David's mother offering love to her future grandchild. I was everyone, a generic source of unwanted attention. "Of course," I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my chest. "I understand completely. Pregnancy can be overwhelming." After I hung up, I sat staring at the phone, trying to decode what had just happened. When had my attempts to show love become attention that needed to be managed? When had my gifts become obligations rather than offerings? When had I become someone who required handling rather than someone who could be trusted to handle herself? Summer arrived, and with it came the baby shower I learned about through Amanda's social media posts. Photos of pastel decorations, elegant finger foods, and young women laughing together in what appeared to be a restaurant's private dining room. Amanda glowed in the center of it all, her hands resting on her rounded belly while friends surrounded her with the kind of joyful attention that new mothers deserve. I scrolled through the images, recognizing some faces, Amanda's college friends, her sister, women from her book club. There was even David's cousin Sarah, whom I'd introduced to Amanda at the wedding, smiling as she handed over a beautifully wrapped gift. Everyone looked so happy, so included, so perfectly matched to Amanda's vision of her celebration. I wasn't in any of the photos, of course. I hadn't been invited. The absence shouldn't have surprised me, yet somehow it did. Baby showers were traditionally hosted by the grandmother, the mother-in-law, the women in the family who'd traveled this road before and wanted to celebrate the journey with someone just beginning it. I'd attended dozens of showers over the years, had helped my friends and neighbors mark these precious milestones. I'd assumed, despite everything, that Amanda would want me there. That blood connections and family ties would matter more than whatever personality conflicts had created this distance between us. I'd been foolish enough to think that the promise of grandmotherhood would restore my place in David's life, that babies had a way of healing rifts and bringing families together. Instead, I was learning that families could contract as easily as they expanded, that new life could create new exclusions as readily as new connections. That weekend, I ran into Amanda at the grocery store, my first face-to-face encounter with her since the wedding nearly 2 years earlier. She was in the produce section, examining avocados with the careful attention of someone who'd been reading about optimal nutrition during pregnancy. Her belly curved beautifully beneath a flowing sundress, and her skin had that luminous quality that pregnancy sometimes brings. "Amanda," I called out, genuinely pleased to see her, hoping this chance meeting might offer an opportunity to bridge whatever gap had opened between us. "You look absolutely radiant. How are you feeling?" She turned toward me with the polite smile she might offer a cashier or a stranger asking for directions. "Oh, hello, Mrs. Morrison. I'm doing well, thank you." Mrs. Morrison. Not Mom, not even Diane. The formal address created a wall between us as effectively as if she'd held up her hand and told me to stop where I stood. "The baby shower looked lovely," I said, immediately regretting the words, but unable to stop them from emerging. "I saw some photos online. Everyone seemed to be having such a wonderful time." Something flickered across Amanda's face. Guilt, maybe, or annoyance at being caught in an awkward moment. "Yes, it was nice. Small, just a few close friends. Very low-key." Low-key. As if including me would have somehow made it high-key. As if my presence would have disrupted the intimate atmosphere she'd worked to create. I nodded as if this explanation made perfect sense. As if mothers-in-law were naturally excluded from low-key celebrations. "Well, I'm so happy for you both," I said, meaning it despite the sting. "If you need anything at all as you get closer to your due date." "That's very kind," Amanda replied, her tone suggesting the conversation had run its natural course. "But David's really been taking good care of me, and my mother will be here for the birth, so we should have plenty of help." Plenty of help. Without me, she had plenty of help. I was not needed, not wanted, not even considered part of the support system that would welcome my grandchild into the world. I was surplus, unnecessary, a complication to be avoided rather than a resource to be grateful for. We parted with polite smiles and vague promises to see each other soon, the kind of social pleasantries that mean nothing and commit no one to anything. I finished my shopping in a daze, automatically selecting items from my list while my mind replayed every word of our brief exchange, searching for signs I might have missed, kindnesses I might have overlooked. There were none. 2 months before the baby was due, I made my final attempt to establish some connection with the life growing inside Amanda, the grandchild I was desperate to love, if only given the chance. I drove to the bookstore in the mall, the one with the extensive children's section, and spent an hour selecting books I thought would be perfect for bedtime stories. Goodnight Moon, the same book I'd read to David every night for years, until he knew it by heart and could recite it along with me. The Velveteen Rabbit, because every child should understand that love makes things real, where the wild things are, for when imagination needed room to roam. Classic stories with beautiful illustrations, books that had comforted and delighted generations of children. I wrapped them carefully and included a note. For bedtime stories and quiet moments, these books brought David and me so much joy together. I hope they'll do the same for your little family. This time, I mailed the package rather than delivering it myself, hoping that the formality of postal delivery might make it seem less intrusive, more like a gift from a distant but caring relative rather than an attempt to insert myself into their preparations. The response came 3 days later, not from David, but from Amanda herself, in a text message to my phone. "Thank you for the books. We've already received several copies of these titles and have selected other books for the nursery. Perhaps you could save these for when the baby is older and comes to visit you. When the baby comes to visit you. Not when we bring the baby to see you. Not when we all spend time together as a family, but when the baby comes to visit. As if these would be formal, scheduled occasions rather than the natural flow of family life. As if I would be a stop on their agenda rather than a destination they looked forward to reaching." I read the message several times, trying to find warmth or affection hidden in the efficient prose. Instead, I found only the careful distance of someone who'd given considerable thought to how little connection she was willing to allow. That night, I put the returned books on the shelf in what I'd secretly begun thinking of as the nursery, the spare bedroom where I'd imagined keeping toys and clothes and all the supplies grandmothers accumulate for visits from grandchildren. The books looked lonely on the empty shelves, like actors waiting for a play that might never be performed. I stood in the doorway of that room, looking at the crib I'd bought and assembled myself, at the changing table with supplies that might expire before they were ever used, at the rocking chair that continued to sit empty despite my hopes that it would soon fulfill its purpose. Everything was ready for a grandchild I might never get to hold, for visits that might never happen, for the kind of relationship I'd taken for granted until I discovered how easily it could be withheld. The silence in that room felt different from the silence in the rest of my house. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was the absence of possibility, the weight of dreams that were slowly suffocating under the reality of my new place in David's life, or rather, my lack of place in it. Outside, I could hear children playing in the neighborhood, their laughter carrying through my open windows like a reminder of everything I was missing, everything I might continue to miss if things didn't change. But nothing I'd tried had changed anything. If anything, my efforts seemed to make the distance greater. My love seemed more burdensome, my presence more unwelcome. I was learning that sometimes trying harder only makes you more of the problem you never realized you were. The withdrawal happened gradually, like tide receding so slowly you don't notice until the shoreline has moved miles away. I stopped calling first, stopped suggesting visits, stopped mentioning holidays or birthdays weeks in advance, hoping to be included in plans that were clearly being made without me. Instead, I began to practice a different kind of love, the kind that steps back, that watches from a distance, that learns to find satisfaction in knowing your child is happy, even when that happiness doesn't include you. It was a harder kind of love than I'd ever imagined possible, requiring muscles I'd never had to develop when David was young, and I was the center of his world. My weekly grocery shopping trips became exercises in careful mathematics. 1 chicken breast instead of 2. Small containers of yogurt instead of family sizes. Half gallons of milk that actually expired before I could finish them, because I'd spent decades calibrating my shopping for a household that no longer existed. The checkout clerks at the store began to recognize me, the older woman who bought modest quantities of everything, whose cart never required a second bag, whose purchases painted the portrait of someone eating alone. They were kind in the way people are to regulars they've begun to worry about, offering extra coupons and asking if I'd found everything I needed with the gentle concern usually reserved for the elderly and obviously lonely. I wasn't elderly, not really. 62 wasn't old by modern standards. But loneliness, I was discovering, aged you in ways that had nothing to do with calendar years. It made you smaller somehow, made your voice quieter, made you apologize for taking up space that no one else wanted anyway. October arrived with its usual fanfare of changing leaves and pumpkin displays, and David's birthday passed without a phone call from me for the first time since he'd learned to answer phones himself. I sat by the telephone that evening, my fingers hovering over the familiar numbers, debating whether this small act of stepping back would register as relief or loss in his new life. At 9:47 p.m., just as I was preparing for bed, the phone rang. "Mom? I just realized I didn't hear from you today." His voice carried a note I couldn't quite identify. Surprise, maybe, or the discomfort of someone who'd discovered that expectations could work both ways. "I didn't want to interrupt if you were celebrating," I said carefully. "I hope you had a lovely day. We went out with some of Amanda's friends, that new Italian place downtown." He paused, perhaps recognizing that this was information about a celebration I hadn't been invited to share. It was nice. Nice. Everything in his life had become nice lately. A neutral word that suggested contentment without enthusiasm, satisfaction without joy. Or maybe that was just how things sounded when filtered through the careful distance he maintained between his old life and his new one. "I'm glad," I said, and meant it. "Please tell Amanda I said hello." Another pause. "She actually mentioned you the other day. Said she felt bad about being so busy lately with the pregnancy and everything. She wants things to be good between all of us." Wants things to be good. Such a diplomatic phrase, suggesting a theoretical desire for harmony without any practical steps toward achieving it. Like saying you want world peace while stockpiling weapons, or claiming to value honesty while perfecting the art of strategic omission. "Of course," I replied. "These early months are so important. She should focus on taking care of herself and the baby." After we hung up, I realized this was the first conversation we'd had in months that felt almost normal, almost like the relationship we used to have. But it had required my complete withdrawal to achieve that normalcy, my willingness to erase myself so thoroughly that my absence became notable, rather than my presence becoming burdensome. The baby arrived on a cold Tuesday in November. I learned about it the same way I'd learned about everything else in their lives lately, secondhand, through the casual mention of someone who assumed I already knew. This time it was my neighbor Carol, who worked at the hospital and had seen Amanda's name on the patient list. "Congratulations, grandmother," she called over the fence separating our backyards. 7 pounds, 2 ounces, I heard. A beautiful little girl, a granddaughter. David had a daughter, and I was learning about her birth from someone reading hospital charts rather than from a phone call bursting with excitement and invitation to share in the miracle. I stood in my backyard holding the laundry I'd been hanging to dry, Carol's words echoing in the space between us while I struggled to process information that should have come with tears of joy rather than the hollow ache of continued exclusion. "Thank you," I managed. "That's wonderful news." That evening, I called David's number, my heart racing with the unfamiliar nervousness of someone who wasn't sure she'd be welcome to share in what should have been a universal celebration. "Hello?" His voice was exhausted, rough with the particular weariness that comes from nights spent learning the rhythms of a newborn's needs. "David, it's Mom. Carol mentioned the baby arrived. Congratulations, sweetheart." "Oh, Mom. Yeah, she's here. Emma Rose, born this morning at 6:23. His voice softened when he said her name, filled with the wonder that every parent experiences when confronted with the reality of having created an entirely new human being. "She's perfect. 10 fingers, 10 toes, already trying to hold her head up. Emma Rose. Such a beautiful name, classic and feminine and strong. I wondered if it had family significance, if Rose had belonged to someone important in Amanda's lineage, if there was a story behind the choice that I'd never be told. "How is Amanda feeling?" I asked. "Tired, but good. Really good. Her mom's been amazing, helping with everything. She's planning to stay for 2 weeks. Make sure we get the hang of things before we're on our own." Her mom would be there for 2 weeks. 2 weeks of first baths and midnight feedings and all the small miracles that marked a baby's earliest days. 2 weeks of bonding and storytelling and the kind of intimate family time I'd imagined sharing with my first grandchild. 2 weeks during which Emma Rose would grow familiar with her maternal grandmother's voice and touch while remaining a stranger to mine. "That's wonderful," I said, because what else could I say? "Please give Amanda my congratulations and love." "I will." "And Mom? Maybe in a few weeks when things settle down you could come meet Emma." Amanda mentioned that might be nice. Might be nice. After the maternal grandmother had established her place as primary helper, after the patterns of care had been set, after the immediate circle of support had been confirmed, then maybe it might be nice for me to meet my granddaughter. I would be penciled in when convenient, scheduled when it wouldn't disrupt more important relationships. 3 weeks passed before that invitation materialized. 3 weeks during which Emma Rose was presumably charming everyone in her immediate orbit, learning to focus her eyes and coordinate her movements, and make the small social connections that would shape her understanding of who belonged in her world and who visited it. The invitation, when it came, was carefully structured. "Sunday afternoon around 2 o'clock, if that works for you. Just for an hour or so. We're trying to keep things low-key while Emma adjusts to everything." An hour. 60 minutes to meet my first grandchild, to hold her and memorize her face and begin building whatever relationship might be possible under these constrained circumstances. I'd waited 9 months to meet her, and I would have 60 minutes to make whatever impression I was going to make. I arrived precisely at 2 o'clock, carrying a single pink rose from my garden rather than the armload of gifts I'd originally planned. Everything about this visit needed to be careful, considered, designed not to overwhelm or impose or suggest that I expected more than the limited welcome I was being offered. Amanda answered the door, still moving with the careful gait of someone whose body was healing from the extraordinary work of bringing life into the world. She looked tired but radiant, wearing the soft glow of new motherhood that made even exhaustion seem beautiful. "Come in," she said, stepping aside to let me enter a living room that had been transformed into a shrine to infant care. Receiving blankets draped over every surface, baby supplies organized with military precision, flowers from well-wishers creating a garden of congratulations that spoke to how many people had been invited to celebrate Emma's arrival. David appeared from the kitchen carrying a baby who seemed impossibly small in his large hands, her tiny face serene with the perfect peace of someone who'd been born into absolute love and security. She was beautiful, dark hair like David's, delicate features that suggested she might favor Amanda's side of the family, skin so perfect it seemed translucent. "Mom, meet Emma," David said, his voice soft with the reverence that all parents feel when introducing their children to the world. "Emma, this is Grandma Diane. Grandma Diane. Not Grandma, not Nana, Not any of the affectionate titles I'd secretly hoped might be mine, but my formal name attached to the generic grandmother designation. Still, hearing it applied to me in connection with this perfect little person made something flutter in my chest. Hope, maybe, or the beginning of love so fierce it frightened me. I held her for exactly 17 minutes. I counted, unable to stop myself from measuring this precious time like a miser counting coins. She was warm and solid and smelled like the particular sweetness of new babies, that combination of milk and powder and the indefinable scent of innocence. Her fingers, impossibly tiny, wrapped around my index finger with the instinctive grip that connected her to every human who'd ever lived. For those 17 minutes, I allowed myself to imagine all the moments we might share, bedtime stories and birthday cakes, teaching her to bake cookies and helping her with homework, being the grandmother who remembered every milestone and celebrated every achievement. I pictured her running to me with scraped knees and hurt feelings, trusting me to make everything better with hugs and wisdom, and the particular kind of love that only grandmothers seem to have infinite reserves of. But when Amanda glanced at the clock and mentioned that Emma would need to eat soon, I understood that my time was finished. I handed her back reluctantly, my arms feeling empty and purposeless without her weight to hold. "She's perfect," I told them both, meaning it completely. "You should be so proud." The drive home seemed longer than usual, my car filled with the ghost of Emma's presence and the echo of might-have-beens. I'd met my granddaughter, held her, begun to love her with the immediate and powerful devotion that grandchildren inspire, but I'd done it as a visitor rather than family, a guest invited for a brief, supervised encounter rather than someone who belonged naturally in her world. That night, I sat in my living room looking at the photo David had reluctantly taken of me holding Emma. An awkward shot where I looked simultaneously thrilled and terrified, where Emma appeared comfortable but distant, where the emotional distance between us was as visible as the physical closeness the camera had captured. I placed this photo on the mantel next to the wedding picture I'd returned to its place of honor, evidence of the love I was allowed to feel but not fully express, the family connections I cherished but couldn't claim. Outside my window, autumn was surrendering to winter, the last leaves falling from trees that would soon stand bare against gray skies. Inside, I began to understand that some loves required their own kind of winter, a time of waiting, of dormancy, of faith that spring might eventually return even when all evidence suggested permanent cold. But they didn't know what I had kept all along. They didn't know about the strength that grows in silence, the wisdom that accumulates in solitude, the particular power that comes from learning to love without expectation of return. They thought they knew who I was, the needy mother-in-law, the intrusive grandmother, the woman who required management and careful handling. They had no idea they were wrong about almost everything. The change began on a Saturday morning in December, when I found myself standing in front of my bedroom mirror, really looking at myself for the first time in months. The woman staring back at me had become a stranger, shoulders curved inward as if apologizing for taking up space, eyes that had learned to look down rather than meet gazes directly, clothes chosen for their ability to help me disappear rather than to express anything about who I was. When had I become so small? When had I started walking through my own life like a guest who wasn't quite sure she was welcome? I remembered the woman I'd been before the marriage ended David's dependence on me, before Amanda's polite rejections taught me that my love was burdensome, before I learned to measure my worth in terms of how little trouble I caused other people. That woman had run the PTA fundraising committee for 5 years, organizing events that brought in thousands of dollars for the school. She'd coordinated neighborhood watch programs, hosted book clubs, volunteered at the food bank every Tuesday morning. That woman had opinions about politics and movies and the best way to grow tomatoes. She'd had friends who called just to chat, who valued her advice and sought her company. She'd been someone who contributed to conversations rather than simply enduring them, someone who took up space because she had something worthwhile to offer the world. Where had she gone? I opened my closet and pushed aside the shapeless cardigans and neutral slacks that had become my uniform of invisibility. In the back, wrapped in plastic and smelling faintly of cedar, hung the emerald green dress I'd worn to David's college graduation. I remembered feeling beautiful that day, proud and confident as I watched my son accept his degree, knowing that I'd played a role in getting him to that moment of triumph. I slipped the dress on, surprised to find it still fit perfectly. The color brought out my eyes, made my graying hair look silver rather than dull, reminded me that I was only 62 years old, hardly ancient, barely even middle-aged by current standards. I had decades ahead of me, years that I could spend apologizing for my existence, or years I could spend remembering that I had value independent of other people's recognition of it. The transformation wasn't just external. As I stood straighter, breathed deeper, met my own gaze in the mirror, something shifted inside my chest. It wasn't pain anymore. It was clarity. For months, I'd been focused on what I'd lost: David's attention, Amanda's acceptance, easy access to my granddaughter. I'd been grieving the family structure I'd expected to be part of, mourning relationships that had apparently been more fragile than I'd realized. But grief, I was beginning to understand, could be a choice as much as a response. I could continue to diminish myself in hopes of becoming acceptable to people who'd already decided I wasn't, or I could remember that my worth didn't depend on their approval. I drove to the library that afternoon, not to use their internet or hide in their quiet spaces, but to apply for the volunteer position I'd seen posted on their community board. The children's reading program needed someone to help with story time, someone who could bring books to life for toddlers and preschoolers, whose attention spans required creativity and enthusiasm to capture. "Do you have experience working with children?" asked Janet, the librarian who interviewed me in her cluttered office surrounded by towers of books waiting to be shelved and processed. "I raised one," I said simply, "and I've been reading stories aloud for over 30 years. I know which books make children laugh and which ones help them fall asleep. I know how to do the voices that make characters feel real." Janet smiled, the first unreserved smile I'd received from anyone in months. "When can you start?" That Thursday, I read The Very Hungry Caterpillar to a group of 8 children between the ages of 2 and 5, using different voices for each day of the week, and encouraging them to make chomping sounds as the caterpillar ate through increasingly elaborate meals. They giggled and squirmed and asked me to read it again, their faces bright with the uncomplicated joy that children bring to stories that capture their imagination. Afterward, a young mother approached me, her toddler still clutching the book I'd used for the reading. "Marcus loved your storytelling," she said. "Do you do private readings? I'd love to hire you for his birthday party." The idea had never occurred to me, but as I drove home, I found myself thinking about the possibilities. I'd always been good with children, had a natural instinct for what captured their attention and held their interest. Maybe this was something I could develop, a way to share the storytelling skills I'd perfected with David during his childhood. That weekend, I researched professional storytellers, discovering an entire community of people who made their living bringing literature to life for young audiences. I learned about performance techniques, about how to adapt classic tales for different age groups, about the business side of freelance entertainment. For the first time in months, I felt excited about something that belonged entirely to me, something that had nothing to do with gaining approval or acceptance from people who'd made it clear those things weren't available. I enrolled in a storytelling workshop offered through the community college, spending Tuesday evenings in a classroom with 12 other adults who shared my fascination with the power of narrative to transport and transform listeners. Our instructor, a woman named Patricia who'd been performing professionally for 20 years, taught us about voice modulation and gesture, about how to use our entire bodies to create the worlds our stories described. "The best storytellers," Patricia said during our third class, "aren't the ones with the most dramatic flair. They're the ones who understand that every story is really about connection, between the teller and the listener, between the listener and the characters, between all of us and the universal experiences that stories help us recognize in our own lives." Connection. I'd been so focused on the connections I'd lost that I'd forgotten about my ability to create new ones, to find people who appreciated what I had to offer, rather than apologizing to people who'd decided it wasn't enough. Christmas approached, and for the first time in years, I didn't spend weeks planning elaborate celebrations for family members who might or might not include me in their own festivities. Instead, I accepted Janet's invitation to help with the library's holiday storytime, a special program featuring winter tales from around the world. I wore the emerald dress and a pair of silver earrings that caught the light when I moved, dressing like someone who had somewhere important to be rather than someone trying to avoid notice. The children were delighted with my telling of The Snow Queen, especially the parts where I used different accents for the various characters Gerda met on her journey to save Kai. After the program, several parents asked for my contact information. Word was spreading about the grandmother storyteller who brought books to life with voices and gestures that made even familiar tales feel fresh and exciting. By New Year's Eve, I had 3 birthday parties booked for January and an inquiry about regular story times at a local preschool. I spent that New Year's Eve alone, but not lonely. I sat in my living room with a cup of tea and a notebook, planning stories for the children who'd become my new audience, thinking about the characters I wanted to bring to life, and the voices I was still discovering I possessed. At midnight, I raised my teacup in a toast to the woman I was becoming, someone who created joy instead of waiting for permission to receive it. January brought my first paid storytelling gig, a 4th birthday party for twin boys whose mother had heard about me through the library network. I arrived at their house carrying a bag of props and costume pieces I'd collected, transforming their living room into a magical forest where brave mice outwitted clever cats and lonely trees found friendship with passing clouds. The children were mesmerized, their parents were delighted, and I felt more useful and appreciated than I had in over a year. As I packed up my materials, the mother pressed an envelope into my hands containing payment that was more generous than we'd agreed upon. "The boys haven't stopped talking about your stories," she said. "Would you be available for their school's reading week? The teacher mentioned they're looking for special guests." Driving home, I realized that something fundamental had shifted in my relationship with the world. I was no longer trying to shrink myself small enough to fit into spaces where I wasn't wanted. Instead, I was expanding into spaces where my presence was valued, where my skills were appreciated, where I could contribute something meaningful to other people's lives. The phone calls from David had dwindled to brief, dutiful check-ins every few weeks, conversations that felt more like obligations than connections. But they no longer left me feeling empty and rejected. I had my own life now, my own purpose, my own sources of satisfaction that didn't depend on his approval or inclusion. I'd started keeping a journal, writing down the stories I wanted to develop and the techniques I wanted to master. But more than that, I was recording my own story. The transformation from someone who apologized for existing to someone who celebrated her own capacity to bring joy to others. One evening in February, as I practiced voices for a new story about a brave little rabbit, I caught sight of myself in the hallway mirror. The woman looking back at me stood straight and tall, her eyes bright with purpose, her face animated with the enthusiasm of someone who'd remembered what it felt like to be good at something important. I was still David's mother, still Emma's grandmother, still someone who loved deeply and hoped for reconciliation, but I was no longer just those things. No longer dependent on those relationships for my sense of worth and identity. I was Diane Morrison, professional storyteller, creator of magic for children who understood that the best gifts came wrapped in words and delivered with love. The workshop had taught me that every good story needed conflict and resolution, characters who grew and changed through their experiences. I was beginning to understand that my own story was still being written, that the chapters I'd thought were endings had actually been transitions to something I'd never expected, but was learning to embrace. I'd discovered something powerful in those months of isolation and rejection, that love didn't always have to be reciprocated to be worthwhile, that value didn't require validation, that sometimes the people who push you away are actually pushing you towards something better than what you'd lost. They still didn't understand who I really was. They saw me as the woman who'd gracefully stepped back, who'd learned to accept their boundaries, who'd stopped being a problem they needed to manage. What they didn't see was the strength I'd built in that stepping back, the confidence I'd discovered in that acceptance, the power I'd found in no longer needing their permission to be myself. They thought my withdrawal had been defeat. They had no idea it had been preparation. Spring arrived early that year, coaxing daffodils from the ground in March and filling the air with the particular sweetness that comes when winter finally surrenders its grip. I was in my garden, planting the vegetable seeds I'd ordered from a catalog, tomatoes and peppers and herbs that would supply my kitchen through the summer months, when I noticed the car parked across the street. It had been there for 3 days, a dark sedan with tinted windows that belonged to no one in the neighborhood. At first, I'd assumed it was connected to the renovation happening 2 houses down, perhaps a contractor's vehicle or someone involved in the extensive remodeling project. But contractors don't usually sit in their cars for hours at a time, and this car always seemed to have someone behind the wheel. I mentioned it to Mrs. Patterson when she stopped by to borrow my pruning shears, a neighborly tradition that had developed over the years as we'd shared gardening tools and advice about the best ways to encourage roses to bloom and discourage rabbits from eating everything we planted. "I noticed it too," she said, glancing toward the street with the casual surveillance that retired people perfect after years of observing their surroundings for entertainment. "The driver seems to be watching your house specifically. Yesterday I saw him with binoculars." Binoculars. That elevated the situation from mildly curious to genuinely concerning, though I couldn't imagine what about my quiet life would warrant such scrutiny. I paid my bills, followed traffic laws, and had never been involved in anything more dramatic than a library book returned 2 days late. That evening, I called the non-emergency police number, feeling slightly foolish as I explained the situation to the dispatcher. "It's probably nothing," I said, "but my neighbors and I have noticed someone watching my house for several days. I'm sure there's a reasonable explanation, but I thought you should know." The officer who arrived 20 minutes later was young and professional, taking notes as I described what I'd observed while he scanned the street for the sedan that had naturally disappeared the moment I'd made the call. He assured me they'd increase patrols in the area and asked me to call immediately if the surveillance resumed. "Has anything unusual happened recently?" he asked as he prepared to leave. "Any changes in your routine, new people in your life, anything that might explain why someone would be interested in monitoring your activities?" I considered the question seriously. My life had become remarkably predictable since I'd started storytelling. Library volunteering on Tuesdays and Thursdays, workshop meetings on Wednesday evenings, private parties on weekends when they were scheduled. I couldn't think of anything that would attract outside attention or justify the kind of professional surveillance that required binoculars and patient observation. "Nothing I can think of," I told him truthfully. "I'm probably just being paranoid." But the next morning, the car was back, parked in a different location, but clearly focused on the same objective. This time, however, something was different. As I watched from my kitchen window while preparing breakfast, I saw the driver get out and walk toward my front door with the purposeful stride of someone who'd made a decision. He was older than I'd expected, probably in his 60s, wearing a suit that looked expensive and carrying himself with the kind of confidence that comes from authority and experience. He knocked politely and waited, hands clasped behind his back like a man accustomed to patience and proper procedure. I opened the door cautiously, leaving the chain lock engaged while I assessed this unexpected visitor who'd been watching my house for nearly a week. "Mrs. Morrison?" he asked, his voice carrying a slight accent I couldn't immediately place. "My name is Detective Harrison. I wonder if I might have a few minutes of your time to discuss a matter of some importance." Detective. Not a stalker or a suspicious character, but law enforcement. I removed the chain and opened the door fully, gesturing him inside while my mind raced through possibilities. Had something happened to David or Amanda? Was Emma hurt? Had there been an accident I hadn't been notified about because I was no longer considered immediate family? "Please sit down," I said, leading him to the living room where morning sunshine streamed through windows I'd recently cleaned. "Is everyone all right? My son? His family?" "As far as I know, they're fine," Detective Harrison said, settling into the chair I offered while studying my face with the practiced attention of someone trained to read people's reactions. "Actually, Mrs. Morrison, I'm here because of some information that's come to light regarding your former husband's death." My former husband. The phrase took me a moment to process, mainly because I'd never thought of Robert in those terms. We'd been married for 28 years when the heart attack took him, a partnership that had ended in death rather than divorce. In my mind, he'd always remained my husband, even though death had technically made me a widow rather than a wife. "Robert died 6 years ago," I said slowly, uncertain why his death would suddenly be of interest to law enforcement. "It was very sudden. A massive heart attack at his office. The doctors said he probably didn't suffer." Detective Harrison nodded, pulling a small notebook from his jacket pocket and consulting pages covered with handwriting I couldn't read from my position on the sofa. "Yes, I'm familiar with the official cause of death. However, some new evidence has emerged that suggests the circumstances may have been more complicated than originally believed." New evidence. The words hung in the air between us, loaded with implications I wasn't ready to consider. Robert had been gone for 6 years. I'd grieved, healed, and built a new life around the reality of his absence. Whatever Detective Harrison was about to tell me felt like a door opening onto a room I'd thought was permanently closed. "What kind of evidence?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know the answer. The detective leaned forward slightly, his expression both professional and sympathetic. "Without going into details that are still part of an ongoing investigation, I can tell you that we've recently obtained information suggesting your husband's death may not have been entirely natural. We're reopening the case and conducting a more thorough examination of the circumstances surrounding his passing. Not entirely natural." The euphemism couldn't quite disguise what he was really saying, that someone might have killed Robert, that the heart attack that had devastated our family might have been induced rather than inevitable. I felt the familiar sensation of the world shifting beneath my feet, the same disorientation I'd experienced when David had asked for space, when Amanda had made it clear I wasn't welcome in their lives. "I don't understand," I said, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. Robert's doctor said the heart attack was completely consistent with his medical history. He'd had high blood pressure for years, some cholesterol issues. The autopsy confirmed heart disease. "Yes, and those findings aren't in question," Detective Harrison assured me. "However, we now have reason to believe that certain accelerating factors may have been involved, factors that weren't apparent during the initial investigation." Accelerating factors. Another euphemism, another way of suggesting that someone had helped Robert die without actually using words that would make the accusation explicit and undeniable. I sat back in my chair, trying to process information that seemed to belong in someone else's life rather than my own. Robert had been a good man, not perfect, but kind and honest and devoted to his family. He'd worked as an accountant for a mid-sized firm, handling tax preparation and financial planning for clients who trusted him with their most private financial information. He'd coached David's Little League team, helped our neighbors with their tax returns, never missed a payment or forgot an anniversary. Who would want to hurt someone like that? And why? "Mrs. Morrison, I realize this is a shock," the detective continued gently. "I want you to know that you're not under any suspicion. We're simply trying to reconstruct the final weeks of your husband's life, understand who he was in contact with, whether he mentioned anything unusual or seemed concerned about anything out of the ordinary. The final weeks of Robert's life." I closed my eyes and tried to remember that time, the last month or so before the heart attack that had changed everything. It had been a busy period. David's graduation from college was approaching, and we'd been planning the celebration dinner and coordinating visits from out-of-town relatives. Robert had been working longer hours than usual, staying late at the office to finish projects before taking time off for the graduation ceremonies. "He seemed tired," I said slowly, searching my memory for details that might now be significant in ways I'd never imagined. "More stressed than usual. He said the firm was going through some kind of audit, and everyone was working overtime to make sure their files were in perfect order." Detective Harrison made notes as I spoke, occasionally asking for clarification or additional details. Had Robert mentioned specific concerns about the audit? Had he brought work home or discussed particular clients? Had anyone called or visited who seemed unusual or unfamiliar? The questions continued for nearly an hour, covering everything from Robert's daily routines to his relationships with colleagues and clients. I answered as thoroughly as I could, though much of what the detective wanted to know felt like ordinary life rather than potential evidence of something sinister. As he prepared to leave, Detective Harrison handed me a business card with his direct number written on the back. "If you remember anything else, no matter how small or seemingly unimportant, please call me immediately. Sometimes details that seem insignificant can be crucial to understanding what really happened." After he left, I sat in my living room staring at the business card and trying to reconcile this new information with everything I thought I knew about Robert's death. For 6 years, I'd carried the straightforward grief of a widow who'd lost her husband to a medical condition that could have been prevented with better diet and exercise habits. I'd blamed myself sometimes for not pushing him harder to take his health more seriously, for not recognizing the warning signs that doctors said should have been obvious. Now, apparently, there might have been no warning signs to recognize, no preventable medical condition to blame. If Detective Harrison was right, Robert had died because someone wanted him dead, not because his heart had simply given out under the stress of middle-aged responsibility. The implications of this possibility extended far beyond my own grief and confusion. If Robert had been murdered, then David had lost his father to violence rather than nature. Emma would grow up never knowing the grandfather who might have spoiled her with the particular devotion that grandfathers reserve for their precious granddaughters. And I had spent 6 years learning to live without a man who might still be alive if someone hadn't decided he needed to die. That evening, I called David for the first time in weeks, needing to share this information with the only other person who'd loved Robert as much as I had. The phone rang 4 times before going to voicemail, his recorded voice cheerful and professional as he invited callers to leave detailed messages that would be returned as soon as possible. "David, it's Mom," I said after the tone. "Something's happened that I need to discuss with you. Nothing urgent, but important. Please call me when you get a chance." He didn't call that night, or the next day, or the day after that. I found myself checking my phone obsessively, jumping at every sound that might be an incoming call, wondering if this news about his father might be significant enough to penetrate whatever barriers he'd constructed around our relationship. But the silence continued, and I began to understand that even something as momentous as the possible murder of his father might not be enough to restore the easy communication we'd once shared. 3 days later, I was in the garden again, pulling weeds that had sprouted after recent rain, when I saw Detective Harrison's car returning to the neighborhood. This time, however, it didn't stop at my house. Instead, it continued to the end of the block and turned into David and Amanda's driveway. I straightened up, my hands still dirty from gardening, and watched as the detective walked to their front door with the same purposeful stride he'd brought to mine. Amanda answered, Emma visible in her arms, and after a brief conversation, she stepped aside to let him enter. They knew something, or Detective Harrison thought they knew something. The investigation that had begun with questions about Robert's death had somehow led to my son's doorstep, to the family that had been so careful to maintain distance from me. I stood in my garden for a long time, watching their house and wondering what secrets were being shared behind those closed doors, what information about Robert's death was considered important enough to discuss with David and Amanda, but not significant enough for David to return his mother's phone calls. Something was shifting in the careful architecture of separation they'd constructed around their lives. Some truth was emerging that might change everything I thought I understood about Robert's death, about my family's dynamics, about the reasons I'd been pushed so systematically to the margins of their world. I had the distinct sensation of standing at the edge of revelation, of waiting for pieces of a puzzle I didn't even know existed to finally arrange themselves into a picture that would explain everything. The feeling wasn't entirely unpleasant. After months of accepting my exile from David's life, after learning to find satisfaction in my own accomplishments and identity, I discovered I was curious rather than anxious about what Detective Harrison might reveal. Whatever truths were waiting to emerge, I was no longer the diminished woman who would have been devastated by them. I was someone who'd learned to stand on her own, who'd built a life that didn't depend on other people's approval or inclusion. Whatever was coming, I was ready for it. The call came at 7:43 on a Thursday evening, just as I was reviewing notes for a storytelling session at the Children's Hospital scheduled for the following week. I'd been practicing voices for a tale about a brave little mouse who discovers that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. A lesson I'd come to understand intimately over the past months. "Mom?" David's voice carried a tension I hadn't heard since he was young, and calling to confess some childhood transgression that had been weighing on his conscience. "David, I'm so glad you called. I left a message earlier this week." "I know. I got it." He paused, and I could hear voices in the background, what sounded like an urgent conversation happening in whispered tones. "Mom, I need to see you. Tonight. Can I come over?" The request surprised me. David hadn't asked to visit my house in over a year, and certainly never with such urgency. Something in his voice suggested this wasn't a social call or a belated response to my message about Detective Harrison. This was something else entirely. "Of course," I said. "Is everything all right? Is Emma okay?" "Emma's fine. She's with Amanda's mother." Another pause, longer this time, filled with the weight of words he was struggling to find. "Mom, there are things I need to tell you. Things I should have told you a long time ago." He arrived 23 minutes later, and I could see immediately that something fundamental had changed. Gone was the confident demeanor he'd worn since his marriage. the casual authority of someone who'd successfully separated his old life from his new one. Instead, he looked haggard, uncertain, like a man who'd been carrying a burden too heavy for his shoulders. I led him to the kitchen, automatically putting the kettle on for tea, the way I'd done thousands of times when he was younger and needed comfort or conversation. Some maternal instincts run too deep to be discouraged by time or distance, or even deliberate rejection. "Detective Harrison came to see you," he said without preamble, settling into the chair where he'd delivered his request for space all those months ago. "He told me he'd spoken with you about Dad's death. Yes, he said there might be new evidence, that Robert's death might not have been entirely natural." I placed a cup of tea in front of him, noting how his hands shook slightly as he reached for it. "David, what's going on? What aren't you telling me?" He stared into the tea as if it might contain answers to questions he didn't know how to ask. When he finally looked up, his eyes were bright with unshed tears, and I saw the boy he'd been before life taught him that emotions were complications to be managed rather than experiences to be shared. "Mom, I need you to know that everything that's happened between us, all the distance, all the ways I've pushed you away." He stopped, taking a shaky breath. "It wasn't because I stopped loving you. It was because I was trying to protect you, protect me." The words made no sense in the context of our relationship, in the reality of my systematic exclusion from his life. How was rejection protection? How was isolation care? Protect me from what? David set down his teacup with deliberate care, the same precise movement he'd used as a child when he needed time to organize his thoughts before explaining something complicated. "From Amanda," he said quietly, "from the truth about who she really is." The kitchen seemed to grow smaller around us, the familiar space suddenly charged with the electricity of revelation. I'd spent months assuming that Amanda simply didn't like me, that personality differences and natural daughter-in-law conflicts had created the distance between us. The possibility that something more deliberate, more calculated, might be involved had never occurred to me. "I don't understand," I said, though part of me was beginning to. David reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a manila envelope, its edges worn from handling. He placed it on the table between us with the reverence usually reserved for evidence of great significance. "Amanda isn't who she pretended to be when we met," he said. "Her real name is Amanda Richardson, and she's been investigating Dad's death for almost 3 years. She married me because she needed access to our family, to information about Dad's work, to details about his final weeks that only we would know." The words hit me like physical blows, each revelation more devastating than the last. Amanda had married David not for love, but for access. Their relationship, their home, their child, all of it built on a foundation of deception so complete that even David had been unaware of its existence until recently. "She's some kind of investigator?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Federal," David confirmed. "Financial Crimes Division. Mom, Dad wasn't just an accountant. He was involved in something much bigger, something that got him killed when he tried to get out." He opened the envelope and pulled out photographs, documents, pages of financial records that meant nothing to me but apparently told a story that had cost Robert his life. I saw bank statements with numbers that seemed impossibly large, transfer records showing money moving between accounts in amounts that dwarfed anything Robert could have legitimately handled. "Money laundering," David explained as I stared at evidence of a life I'd never known my husband was living. Dad's firm wasn't just preparing tax returns and managing investment portfolios. They were cleaning money for people who couldn't afford to have their financial activities scrutinized by legitimate institutions. The Robert I'd been married to for 28 years had been methodical about balancing our checkbook, careful about retirement savings, concerned about having enough money for David's college expenses. The Robert revealed in these documents had been moving millions of dollars through accounts designed to hide the origins of wealth that came from sources I probably didn't want to understand. "He tried to stop," David continued, his voice breaking slightly. "Amanda's investigation shows that Dad went to the FBI about 6 weeks before he died. He was going to testify against his partners, provide evidence about their operations in exchange for immunity and protection. 6 weeks before he died. The time frame when I'd noticed Robert seemed more stressed than usual, when he'd been working longer hours and worrying about the audit at his firm. He hadn't been concerned about routine business practices being scrutinized. He'd been terrified that his criminal associates would discover his betrayal before the federal agents could protect him. Someone found out he was cooperating, I said, the pieces falling into place with horrible clarity. His heart attack was induced, David confirmed. A drug that mimics the symptoms of natural cardiac arrest, but leaves no trace unless you know specifically what to look for. By the time the FBI realized their informant was dead, the opportunity to build a case against his partners had died with him. I sat back in my chair, trying to reconcile this new information with everything I thought I'd known about my life, my marriage, my husband's character. Robert had been living a double life so successfully that I'd had no idea the man I shared a bed with was involved in criminal activities that ultimately cost him his life. Amanda's been trying to finish what Dad started, David continued, to gather enough evidence to prosecute the people who killed him. That's why she needed to get close to our family, why she married me, why she's been so careful to keep you at a distance. Because I might have interfered with her investigation, I said, understanding finally dawning. Because she was trying to protect you, David corrected. Mom, these people killed Dad when they discovered his betrayal. If they'd realized that federal agents were still investigating, if they'd suspected that Amanda was anything other than what she appeared to be, they might have decided that eliminating our entire family was the safest course of action. The full scope of Amanda's deception was staggering. For almost 3 years, she'd been playing the role of David's wife, while secretly working to bring his father's killers to justice. Every dinner, every conversation, every intimate moment had been part of an elaborate performance designed to maintain her cover while gathering the evidence needed to ensure that Robert's death wasn't meaningless. Emma? I said suddenly, thinking of my granddaughter and the complications that a child would add to such a dangerous investigation. David's expression softened slightly. She loves Emma completely. That part isn't pretense, Mom. Whatever else Amanda has hidden from us, her love for our daughter is absolutely real. Our daughter. Not his daughter, not Amanda's daughter, but theirs together. A family created in the midst of deception, but genuine in its own complicated way. And you? I asked. Does she love you? The question hung between us, loaded with implications that went far beyond the immediate crisis. David had discovered that his marriage was built on lies, that the woman he'd trusted with his heart had been using their relationship to pursue an investigation that put their entire family at risk. Yet he was here, in my kitchen, defending her motivations and protecting her secrets. She says she does, David replied quietly. She says it started as an assignment but became real somewhere along the way. She says falling in love with me was the complication she hadn't planned for. Do you believe her? David was quiet for a long moment, staring at the document spread across my kitchen table. I want to, he said finally, because the alternative, that Emma and I have been nothing but convenient cover for her investigation, is too painful to accept. I reached across the table and covered his hand with mine, the first physical contact we'd shared in over a year. His fingers were cold, trembling slightly with the stress of revelations that had upended everything he'd thought he knew about his life. David, why are you telling me this now? Why risk exposing Amanda's investigation? He looked up at me with eyes that held a mixture of love and regret I hadn't seen since he was a child, confessing to broken windows or lies told to avoid punishment. Because it's over, he said. They made arrests yesterday. The people who killed Dad, the partners who've been running the money laundering operation, Detective Harrison and Amanda's team have enough evidence to put them away permanently. The investigation was complete. The dangerous game Amanda had been playing for 3 years had finally reached its conclusion. The killers would face justice, and my family could begin the complicated process of healing from deceptions that had been designed to protect us. And because, David continued, his voice breaking completely now, I've spent the last year pushing away the person I love most in the world in order to protect an investigation that required me to pretend my mother was less important than she really is. I've been the worst son imaginable, and I don't know if you can ever forgive me. I stood up and walked around the table, pulling my son into my arms the way I'd done countless times when he was young, and the world seemed too complicated to navigate alone. He collapsed against me, and I felt his shoulders shake with sobs that had been building for months of enforced separation and impossible choices. There's nothing to forgive, I whispered into his hair, still thick and dark like his father's had been. You were protecting your family. You were doing what you thought was right. But even as I comforted him, Part of me was processing the full implications of what he'd revealed. Amanda had orchestrated our separation, had calculated exactly how to make me seem intrusive and unwelcome, had manipulated family dynamics to ensure that I would voluntarily remove myself from situations where I might accidentally discover her true identity. She'd been brilliant, actually. Rather than creating dramatic conflicts that might have attracted attention, she'd simply made my presence feel burdensome until I'd chosen to absent myself. She'd turned my own love for David into the weapon that kept me away from their lives. It was cruel in its elegance, devastating in its effectiveness. And yet, if it had been necessary to protect my family and bring my husband's killers to justice, could I really condemn her for it? The answer, I realized, would depend entirely on what happened next, because now that the investigation was over, now that the dangerous game had ended, there was no reason for the barriers between us to remain. Amanda could reveal her true self, David could stop pretending I was unwelcome, and Emma could finally meet the grandmother who'd been waiting in the wings for permission to love her. Unless, of course, Amanda had grown comfortable with the distance she'd created and decided that keeping me excluded was preferable to dealing with the complications that my full inclusion in their lives might create. That question would be answered soon enough. Tonight, David had returned to me, bringing revelations that explained years of pain and confusion. Tomorrow, I would discover whether Amanda was ready to build a relationship based on truth rather than deception. Either way, I was no longer the diminished woman who'd first been pushed away. I was someone who'd learned to stand on her own, who'd built a life that didn't require validation from others to have meaning and value. Whatever came next, I would face it from a position of strength rather than desperation. And that, perhaps, was the most important truth of all. Amanda came to me the next morning. I was sitting in my garden with my first cup of coffee, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of gold and pink, when I saw her walking up the path carrying Emma. No car in the driveway, no announcement of her arrival, just a woman in jeans and a simple sweater, looking more human than I'd ever seen her, approaching with the careful steps of someone who wasn't entirely sure of her welcome. Emma had grown since my brief visit months ago. Her hair was longer now, dark curls that caught the morning light, and her eyes, Robert's eyes, I realized with a start, were bright with the alert curiosity of a child discovering the world around her. She babbled softly as Amanda approached, pointing at the flowers I'd planted along the walkway, with the universal excitement that children bring to anything colorful and beautiful. "Good morning, Diane," Amanda said, stopping a few feet away with the formal distance that had characterized all our previous interactions. But something was different in her posture, in the way she met my eyes directly, instead of offering the polite but distant smiles I'd grown accustomed to. "Good morning," I replied, setting down my coffee cup and studying the woman I was supposedly meeting for the first time. "David told me everything last night." She nodded, shifting Emma to her other hip in the unconscious way that mothers develop when holding a child becomes as natural as breathing. "I asked him not to, but I understand why he felt he had to. The secrets have been eating him alive." There was an awkwardness to the moment that went beyond the obvious complications of our situation. How do you build a relationship with someone who's been systematically deceiving you for 3 years? How do you separate the woman from the agent, the mother from the investigator, the daughter-in-law from the federal employee who'd been using your family to solve a case? "Would you like to sit down?" I offered, gesturing to the garden bench Robert had built for me during our second summer in this house. "We could talk while Emma explores the flowers." Amanda hesitated, then moved toward the bench with the careful movement of someone entering territory that might be hostile. She set Emma down on the grass, where the toddler immediately became fascinated with the texture of the lawn and the bright yellow daffodils blooming in neat rows along the garden border. We sat in silence for several minutes, both watching Emma's innocent exploration while we navigated the complicated emotional landscape that lay between us. Finally, Amanda spoke, her voice softer than I'd ever heard it. "I need you to know that pushing you away was the hardest part of this assignment," she said without looking at me. "I've spent 3 years studying your family, reading David's stories about his childhood, understanding how much you mean to him. Making him choose between his wife's comfort and his mother's feelings was cruel, and I hated myself for it every single day." I considered her words carefully, searching for signs of manipulation or calculated sympathy. But what I heard was exhaustion. the weariness of someone who'd been living a lie for so long that the weight of deception had become almost unbearable. "It was effective," I said quietly. "I convinced myself that I was the problem, that I needed to change or disappear to make David happy." Amanda winced as if my words had physically hurt her. "That was never supposed to happen. I wanted you to stay away, but I never wanted you to believe you were unwelcome. I didn't know how else to protect you." Emma toddled over to us, her small hands clutching a dandelion she'd managed to pick despite her unsteady coordination. She offered it to me with the generous spirit that children possess, before the world teaches them that gifts should be conditional or strategic. "Thank you, sweetheart," I said, accepting the flower with the reverence it deserved. "It's beautiful." Emma beamed at my response, then turned to Amanda with the expectant look of a child seeking approval for her generous gesture. "Mama," she said clearly, one of the few words in her growing vocabulary. "Mama." I felt something shift in my chest as I heard my granddaughter address Amanda with such complete trust and affection. Whatever else might be complicated about our situation, Emma's love for the woman who'd raised her was pure and uncomplicated. Amanda had been her mother in every way that mattered, regardless of the circumstances that had brought them together. "David told me that your feelings for him became real," I said, watching Amanda's face carefully for signs of truth or deception. "That falling in love with him complicated your assignment." She was quiet for so long that I wondered if she was going to answer at all. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a vulnerability I'd never heard from her before. "I was supposed to marry him, gather the information I needed, and then arrange for the marriage to end naturally once the investigation was complete," she said. "It was supposed to be clinical, professional. I'd done similar assignments before without any personal complications. But David isn't like other people I've investigated. He's genuinely good, kind and honest and trusting in ways that made lying to him feel like poisoning something pure." She looked down at Emma, who was now examining the dandelion with scientific intensity. And then Emma happened, and everything changed completely. I understood what she meant. Children have a way of making theoretical situations personal, of transforming carefully planned strategies into emotional commitments that can't be easily abandoned. Once Emma existed, Amanda couldn't simply complete her assignment and walk away. She'd become a mother, with all the fierce protective instincts that entailed. "The people who killed your husband," Amanda continued, "they're not just criminals. They're ruthless in ways that would make your blood freeze if you truly understood what they're capable of." When I realized that David and Emma had become more important to me than the case I was working, I became terrified that any mistake, any exposure of my real identity, might put them in danger. "So you made sure I couldn't accidentally expose you by keeping me away completely," I said, understanding finally dawning with painful clarity. "It seemed like the safest option. You're observant, intelligent, naturally curious about the people in David's life. If you'd spent time with me, if you'd asked the right questions or noticed the wrong details, you might have realized that I wasn't who I claimed to be, and if that had happened," she didn't need to finish the sentence. "If my curiosity had exposed Amanda's investigation, if the criminals had realized they were being monitored, my entire family could have been eliminated to protect the money laundering operation that had already cost Robert his life." "I'm sorry," Amanda said simply. "I'm sorry for the pain I caused, for the year you missed with Emma, for making David choose between us. I'm sorry that protecting you required hurting you." I studied her face as she spoke, looking for signs of the calculating federal agent who'd orchestrated my isolation with such clinical precision. Instead, I saw a young mother who'd been forced to make impossible choices, who'd sacrificed her own comfort and my family's happiness to ensure that we all survived her dangerous assignment. "What happens now?" I asked. "The investigation is over. The criminals are arrested. What happens to us?" Amanda looked at me directly for the first time since she'd arrived, and I saw something in her eyes that I'd never noticed before. Hope, mixed with fear, and a desperate desire for something she wasn't sure she had the right to ask for. "I'd like to try to build something real," she said quietly. "If you're willing, if you can forgive me for the ways I've failed you and David. I know I don't deserve a second chance, but Emma deserves to know her grandmother, and David deserves to have his mother back in his life." I looked down at Emma, who had abandoned her flower and was now attempting to catch a butterfly that kept landing just beyond her reach. She moved with the determined optimism of someone who believed that persistence would eventually be rewarded, that beautiful things were worth pursuing even when they seemed impossible to capture. "I've spent the last year learning to be happy without you," I said carefully, "building a life that doesn't depend on David's approval or your acceptance. I won't go back to being the woman who shrinks herself small enough to fit into spaces where she's barely tolerated." Amanda nodded, understanding that this was a boundary rather than a rejection. "I wouldn't want you to. The woman David talks about, his mother who raised him to be kind and strong and generous, she shouldn't have to diminish herself for anyone. But I also won't pretend that I don't want to be part of Emma's life," I continued. "I won't pretend that I don't miss my son or that I don't hope we can find a way to be family again." We sat quietly for a few minutes, watching Emma discover the joy of grass stains and flower petals. Finally, Amanda spoke again. "There's something else I need to tell you," she said. "About the investigation. About what we found regarding your husband's death." I felt my chest tighten, wondering what additional revelations might be coming. "What is it?" "Robert didn't just try to expose the money laundering operation," Amanda said. "He was trying to protect you specifically. The payments he was helping to clean weren't just profits from criminal activities. They were ransom money. Ransom money. The word sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the morning air. "Someone had discovered information about your background, about your family," Amanda continued. "They were planning to kidnap you to force Robert's continued cooperation. He went to the FBI not just because he wanted out of the criminal enterprise, but because he learned that you were going to be their next target." The final piece fell into place with devastating clarity. Robert hadn't died because of greed or professional betrayal. He'd died trying to save me from criminals who would have used my safety to control his actions. His death had been a sacrifice, an attempt to protect his family that had cost him everything. "He loved you enough to die for you," Amanda said softly. "I thought you should know that." I closed my eyes and felt tears I hadn't expected sliding down my cheeks. For 6 years, I'd carried guilt about Robert's death, wondering if I could have recognized the warning signs, if I could have convinced him to take better care of his health. Now I learned that his death had been an act of love so profound, it took my breath away. Emma toddled back to us, apparently tired of chasing butterflies and ready for whatever entertainment the adults might provide. She climbed onto my lap with the unconscious trust that children reserve for people they instinctively recognize as safe, settling against my chest with a contentment that made my heart swell. "She knows you," Amanda observed. "Even though she spent so little time with you, she recognizes something familiar." I held my granddaughter close, breathing in the sweet scent of her hair and feeling the solid warmth of her small body against mine. She felt like Robert, the way she relaxed completely when she was content, the way she studied the world with intense curiosity before committing to action. "I'd like to tell her stories about her grandfather," I said. "The real Robert, not the man involved in criminal activities, but the father who taught David to throw a baseball and the husband who brought me flowers every Friday for 28 years. "I'd like that too," Amanda replied. "She should know about the good man he was, not just the circumstances that led to his death." We talked for another hour, carefully beginning the process of building trust that should have developed naturally over the past 3 years. Amanda told me about her real background, growing up in foster care, joining law enforcement to make a difference, being assigned to financial crimes because of her talent for mathematics, and her ability to disappear into whatever role an investigation required. I told her about my storytelling, about the children who'd taught me that I had value beyond my role as David's mother or Robert's widow. I explained how the past year of forced independence had helped me discover strengths I'd never known I possessed. When she finally prepared to leave, Amanda paused at the garden gate, Emma secure in her arms, but reaching toward me with the plaintive cry of a child who didn't understand why pleasant visits had to end. "Would you like to come to dinner Sunday?" she asked hesitantly. "David's been cooking again, something he started doing when the stress of keeping secrets made it hard for him to relax. He makes a roast that's almost as good as the ones you used to make. Almost as good. Not better. Not a replacement for traditions I'd established, but a continuation of family practices that honored what had come before while making room for new variations. I'd like that very much, I said, but I have one condition. Amanda waited, her expression cautious but hopeful. No more secrets, I said firmly. No more protection that requires deception. If we're going to be family, We're going to trust each other with the truth, even when it's complicated or frightening." She smiled, the first completely genuine expression I'd ever seen from her. "No more secrets," she agreed. After they left, I sat in my garden holding the wilted dandelion Emma had given me, thinking about the circuitous route that had brought us to this moment. I'd lost a marriage, a son, and a year with my granddaughter, but I'd gained something too: knowledge of my own resilience, confidence in my own worth, the understanding that love doesn't always look the way we expect it to. Robert had died protecting me from dangers I'd never known existed. David had pushed me away to keep me safe from investigations that could have cost us everything. Amanda had built walls between us to ensure that none of us would follow Robert into whatever hell awaited people who crossed the wrong criminals. All of it had been love, even when it felt like abandonment. All of it had been family, even when it looked like rejection. That evening, I called Detective Harrison to thank him for his work bringing Robert's killers to justice. He was gracious and professional, explaining that the case would likely take months to work through the court system, but that the evidence was strong enough to ensure convictions. "Mrs. Morrison," he said before we hung up, "I want you to know that your husband was a brave man. What he did, coming forward when he knew the risks, that took real courage. Real courage." I thought about that phrase as I prepared for bed that night, considering all the different forms that bravery might take. Robert's courage had been dramatic and ultimate, but there were other kinds of bravery too. David's courage in living with secrets that were destroying him. Amanda's courage in maintaining a cover that required her to hurt people she'd grown to love. My own courage in learning to build a life that didn't depend on other people's approval. Sunday dinner was awkward at first, all of us navigating conversations that had been forbidden for so long that we'd forgotten how to talk to each other naturally. But Emma served as a bridge between the adult complications, delighting in having her grandmother's attention and treating the meal like a grand adventure rather than a diplomatic summit. David cooked with the intense concentration of someone who'd learned to find peace in precise measurements and careful timing. Amanda helped Emma eat while monitoring our interactions with the careful attention of someone still learning to trust that good outcomes were possible. And I told stories. Stories about Robert's terrible jokes and his better cooking. Stories about David's childhood adventures and the ways he'd always been brave enough to stand up for what he thought was right. Stories that helped us remember who we'd been before circumstances forced us to become people we'd never intended to be. As I drove home that evening, I realized that the woman who'd been pushed away 3 years ago couldn't have handled the revelations about Robert's death or Amanda's deception. She would have been devastated by the betrayals, overwhelmed by the complexity, unable to separate love from manipulation or protection from abandonment. But the woman I'd become, the woman who'd learned to tell stories that brought joy to strangers, who'd discovered her own strength in solitude, who'd built a life that didn't require validation to have meaning, she could handle anything. Sometimes silence is the loudest truth. Sometimes the people who push you away are actually pulling you towards something better than what you've lost. Sometimes love requires such complicated courage that it looks exactly like abandonment until you understand what's really happening. I'd learned that family isn't just about blood or proximity or even affection. It's about people who are willing to make impossible sacrifices for your welfare, even when those sacrifices cost them everything they thought they wanted. It's about people who save the best stories for you, even when they have to wait years for permission to tell them. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, it's about people who come back to you when the danger is past and the secrets are finally safe to share, ready to build something real on the foundation of everything they couldn't say when it mattered most. The story wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. But this time, I was writing it from a position of strength rather than need, from wholeness rather than brokenness, from the unshakable knowledge that I was worthy of love, even when that love had to hide itself to keep me safe. That knowledge, perhaps, was the most valuable truth of all. Some families are broken by secrets. Others are broken by the truth. The luckiest ones are strong enough to survive both, to find their way back to each other when the danger has passed and the lies are no longer necessary. I was beginning to believe we might be one of the lucky ones after all.